In today's video, I again want to show you how many things you can nowadays do with CSS only. And I mean that in a way that you do not need any complicated big JavaScript libraries like GSOC, for example, or Frame Motion to build really complex or fancy looking animations. Of course, all of them also have their place, but in order to be a really good front-end developer, I want to show you how you can do things with CSS as well. And that is why today we are going to rebuild the navigation bar in macOS, also known as the dock. And what we're going to build is the animation you see when you hover over the icons. If we look at the final result, then you see the effect that we're going to replicate. What you see is when you hover over these icons, that not only the icon you currently hover scales up, but also the ones right next to them start already to scale. And this kind of gives some sort of triple effect or a wave effect. If you move across them, you see that this wave kind of moves throughout the dock. And also when you have your cursor right over a specific icon and move to the left or right side, you see that the one that's closer to the cursor already grows bigger than the one that's further away. And this is the effect that we're going to replicate today. For that, we're going to use plain old CSS and just a little bit of JavaScript to detect the mouse position on top of an icon. Next to that, we're mainly going to use CSS variables, as well as one of the newer selectors, the CSS has selector, to also apply the styling to the previous and the next icons. So let's quickly dive in and reset everything so we don't have the animations and only the dock. And from that point on, we will start adding the animation step by step. So if we now have a look at our starting point, we see that the only hover animation that's still there is the hover animation of the tooltip. And if we quickly take a look at the code, we see that this is a default Vite project that has both React as well as TypeScript enabled. Apart from that, for the styling, we only use plain CSS, and there's pretty little files in here. There is a main TypeScript file, which is default for Vite. This simply renders the app, and all of our logic will be in app.tsx. Next to that, we also import a style sheet. And in this style sheet, there's a few basic styles that are mainly right now styling the dock. But all of those styles are not relevant for making this animation, so it's also not something that I will discuss in this video. If we open the app.tsx, we also see that there is an app component in here, and that actually renders this dock. This dock is a navigation element with an unordered list in there. Then it has a bunch of list items that have an image for the icon as well as some text for the tooltip. And they also link to a certain place. But that is the only thing that is currently there. So the first step for creating this animation is making the current app icon that we are hovering grow in size. We can do multiple things. For this, we could decide to use the CSS transform property, but one downside of transform is that if you scale up an element, it won't push everything that's around it out of place. And that's also a really good thing in most of the cases, but currently we actually want it to push everything away because that gives us the ripple or wave effect. So that means that in this case, it's actually not possible to use transform to scale this up. At least not without adding a lot of complicated JavaScript to calculate transforms and moves for all of the other icons. So instead of using scale, I actually want to use height and width this time, because that will push everything out of the way like you expect it to do. And depending on the types of animations you are doing, animating width and height is something that's less performant than doing the same thing with transforms. However, I think in this case, because of the effect we really want to have on all of the other elements, it's a valid use case to still opt for width and height because it brings us a lot of benefits too. So in order to add this hover effect, I am going to go to the style sheet and I will add all of the new styles that actually are applicable to the animation on the top of the style sheet. In this case, as soon as we hover this icon, which can be targeted if we take a look, it can be targeted by the app class name, which targets the list item. So what we want to do is, as soon as we app.hover, then we want to resize this icon. By default, if we scroll down, we can see that they have a width and height of 60 pixels. So we could, for example, give this a width of 90 pixels and a height of 90 pixels as well. If we now hover, we see that this icon scales up. However, we also see that everything else moves to the top. But what we actually want to happen is that the icon we currently hover sticks out on the top of the dock. And for that, we could add a negative margin top of, in this case, 30 pixels, which is the difference between 60 and 30. Because if we add a margin top of minus 30 pixels, it will pull the icon up 30 pixels as well. And then already we see that the icon kinda feels like it's transforming from the bottom only up instead of from the center. And that way, all of the other icons won't move around anymore. The only thing that we still need to add is also a transition to this changing in size. So for that, we can add another class called app, then add a transition where we scale both the width, the height, as well as the margin top. And in that case, we are gonna add a cubic bezier for the animation, which just is a different kind of easing that looks a little bit better to the eye. And we add a duration of 100 milliseconds. So if we now hover, we see that there's something bouncing. And the reason is because there actually should also be a comma after the last property we want to transition. And if we do that, we already see that one icon is now scaling properly as well. And it already might look like we kind of have this wave effect because the icon next to it is still scaling down when we go to the next one. But let me tell you, once we've added the other details, you will see a big difference in animation. This is far from complete. What I want to do next is, as soon as you hover one item, I also want to start scaling up the next one already. So that way, the app closest to the app you're currently hovering also already will be bigger in size than the rest. And now comes a very interesting point. Targeting the item right next to the app you're currently hovering is pretty straightforward to do. We can use the plus selector because this plus selector says that the app we're currently hovering should have a .app right next to it because this is a direct sibling selector. And then it applies the styles to this specific target. So we could say width 80 pixels, height 80 pixels, and a negative margin top of minus 20 pixels. And if we do that, we see that the second one right next to it also scales up. But we should also do that to the item on the left. And that, until recently, was quite a bit harder to achieve, or it was pretty much impossible without using JavaScript. But not anymore, because not that long ago, CSS introduced the has selector. And this has selector lets us do the following. With this has selector, we can say .app:has, and then we do plus .app:hover. So what this does is it searches for any .app, so any list item, and then it checks if this has an app that has right next to each other, because again, we use a sibling selector, an app that is actually hovered. And if this matches, then it applies the styles to the first selected element. So instead of this sibling selector where the styles get applied to the right side, so to the last thing selected, this has selector gives us the option to apply the styles to the first thing. So in this case, as soon as there's one app that has a direct sibling of also .app, but that's hovered, then we can apply styles. So that means that we can copy these styles in here. And if we now hover the apps, we already see that both the previous and the next item scale up. And now we can do exactly the same for one item further to the left and the right by simply copying this and then adding another sibling selector and making this 70 pixels as well as 10. And we do the same for the has selector. Only this time we're going to say that it has a plus app dot hover. So in this case, it should have an app, then right next to it should be another app, and then right next to that should be an app that's hovered. And also in that case, we're going to add 70 pixels as well as 10 pixels. And that already gives us kind of a wave animation. The only thing that's not happening is if you move around one specific app, that the icons already start to scale up and down just a little bit, which is exactly the detail that actually makes this animation so beautiful. But that's really the only thing that's still missing to fully have this wave animation functioning like Apple's dock. And now I was thinking, how would I want to achieve that? I really want to make things as simple as possible. And that's why I thought, I think we can use CSS variables for this. So in order to use CSS variables for it, what I want to do with them is instead of hard coding 80 pixels or 70 pixels for the size of the icon, I actually want to have that number fluctuate a little bit, depending on whether you are on the left side of the icon or on the right side of the icon. So for that, I actually want to know where you're currently at with your cursor on top of the icon. If you're in the center, the value I want to add should be 0 because both of them are equally distanced from your cursor, so there shouldn't be any difference. But if you go to the left, let's say 10% to the left, I want to add 1 pixel in height and width to the left side and actually subtract it from the right side. So that means that I want to come up with a number that based on the distance from left to right on the icon, on the left side you get -5 and on the right side you get +5. And that's actually applied to the left side or the right side of the icon. Might sound complicated, but let's get to it step by step and you'll see that it's hopefully pretty straightforward. And before we continue, did you already see that I'm right now offering a 14-day free trial of my Discord? This Discord channel is a channel that costs €5 a month, but that also means that I can really dedicate time to help you with any issue you encounter during your day-to-day work, because I can simply dedicate time to this right now. So instead of being a number in a random channel, actually I'm trying to set up something a little bit different, and I would hope to see you there. Definitely check out the link below. Now, let's go build that dock again. So for that, we need to go back to JavaScript first. What I want to do is I want to attach a mouse over event or a mouse move event over this list item. And that list item will then give me the position where your cursor is on top of the app icon. So for that, I'm gonna add a new function called handle app hover. And that handle app hover I will call whenever you move with your cursor over the list item. So for that, I'm going to select all of these list items by using Command D in VS Code. And then I'm going to say on mouse move is handle app hover. So this way, that function will get called whenever you move your mouse over an app icon. This will give us an event, which is a react.mouse event. And because it's TypeScript, we also need to say that it gets a list element as its target. And this event gives us a few things. First, we get the mouse position, and we can get that by getting event.clientX. So that way we get the X position of our mouse. And this is the position relative to the window. So it has nothing to do with the thing you're hovering yet. Next to that, I also need to know where this icon exactly is on the screen. For that, we can get icon position left is event.currentTarget.getBoundingClientRect. And that's a function we can execute, and that gives us a left property. And this left property then is the value that the icon is actually offsetted from the left of the screen. The only other variable we still need is the icon width, which also is something we can get from the bounding client, which gives us the width of the list item. And if we console.table these values, and table is actually very nice because if you pass in an object in there and we go to the console, and we see that the console nicely creates a table from this and actually keeps the properties. So it's a lot easier to see what value we're actually looking at. But if I clear this, we see that as soon as we hover over this icon, our mouse position updates, but we also get the distance from the left as well as the width of our icon. And what we can calculate with these numbers is the exact distance, or actually percentage, that the cursor is within the icon. Because if we take this left position and add the width, we know what the right position is. And then we actually need to know how far this value lies somewhere between the first and the second value. And that number we can actually get by calculating a variable, for example, cursor distance, that is mouse position minus the icon position left divided by the width. And this number, if we also add that to our console.table and we hover, then we see that we get a number between 0 and 1 that tells us the distance the cursor is right now over the app icon. So 0.1 would mean 10%, 0.9 would, for example, mean 90%. And with this value, I now want to create some sort of a CSS variable that has a number between -5 and +5 pixels. And to do that, I created a very small helper function called scale value. And that helper function takes in 3 arguments. The first one is the cursor distance, or a number. The second one is an array of 2 numbers, in this case 0 to 1. And the second one is an array, again, of 2 numbers, -5 and 5. And perhaps you're already seeing what this is doing, or if you've worked with Framer Motion before, you also might recognize this. It is taking in a number, and we're telling it that this number lies between 0 and 1. And then we're asking it to convert this to a number that is actually lying between -5 and +5. And instead of hard-coding this arbitrary number, I'm actually going to create a variable called max additional size is 5. And that way, instead of having an arbitrary number, we can actually now use this variable simply because it's more readable. We could even add a comment here so another developer would know why we're using a random number of -5 and 5. To get this -5, we can simply multiply this number by -1. And then we can assign this to a variable, for example, offset pixels. And if we also add this to our console.table and then hover over our menu item, we can now see that we get a number, for example, -4 when we're close to the left edge and +3 when we're further to the right. And this number is then a number that I want to add to the other icons. For that, we need to create CSS variables with JavaScript. And in order to use those within CSS, any parent of our app element needs to have these CSS variables. So in our case, I'm going to decide that this doc is the element that will actually set those CSS variables, which means that any child of this doc element is able to use this CSS variable. And in order to add any styles to this doc element, we first need to get a ref in React. We can do that by creating a new doc ref is useRef, and in there that defaults to null, and then we add HTML div element as our TypeScript type, and then we can copy this ref and add that on our nav element. Then as soon as you hover any of these app icons, we first need to check if there is no doc ref, then we don't do anything, because then there's no CSS variable we can write, which is usually the case during the initial render. And if there is one, we're gonna run docref.current style.set property. And this set property gives us the option to set a custom CSS variable. We're gonna call this doc offset left. And that in this case gets the value offset pixels with the pixel unit attached to it. And if we then inspect our doc, we see that when we hover over the app icon, this variable gets set as an inline style. The only thing is, if we move closer to the left, it gets a negative value. Where actually, if we go to the left, it should become a positive value, at least for the left icon. For the right icon, it should indeed become a negative value. And as soon as we move to the right, the left one should become a negative value, and the right one should become a positive value. So we're actually gonna need another variable, which is the offset on the right. And then we are gonna multiply this left offset with -1. And if we then hover the app icon, we see that the offset left becomes a positive number when we're on the left and a negative number for the right side. And if we go to the opposite side, we see that the left number becomes a negative number and the right side becomes a positive number. And with that, we now have a value that we can actually add to our styles. So let's quickly go back to the CSS, and then we're gonna change those 4 selectors. And in here, we simply need to add the CSS variables to all of these numbers. In order to add plus variable and then doc offset left, we actually need to wrap this in calc, because this way CSS can add both of these numbers together. And it's also good to add a default value of 0 pixels, because if this variable is not set, we still have a default of 0 pixels instead of an invalid calc, which wouldn't work at all anymore. And then we're actually making a small mistake here, because this side is the right side, because the app is on the left. So let's quickly add a comment in here as well, right side and left side, which means that this should become the offset right, and the same here and here and here, and change those back to 70 again. And of course, we should also add this offset to the margin. Only difference here is that it should be a minus number, because if our app icon grows, we should also move the app icon further to the top instead of lower. So that means that this also becomes a calc, but then has this offset times -1. And then we can copy the exact same thing into our left side as well. We only need to update the variables to left, and then copy the same thing for the second item and also change them to left. And now we've done that, what it's doing is it is adding this variable on top of the 80 pixels. So if we now hover our icon, everything should work. And it does. If we hover over the icon and move from left to right, we see that this value gets added and everything scales up and down. And this way, I think we came really close to the animation that macOS also has added to their dock. That with almost 0 JavaScript, the only JavaScript we needed was to be able to calculate this position over the icon. And I hope you agree with me, this just looks super nice and it's so smooth. And looking at the code, there's actually not a lot that we need to do in order to achieve this. So I really hope this video was helpful to you and shows you that there is a lot you can do with plain CSS without adding a lot of complicated libraries. And I think building these kind of things every now and then is simply a super fun challenge, because it's so easy to just jump to any JavaScript library that does a lot of these things for you. But it's just a craft if you can do them without these kind of libraries and still have a super stellar experience. And that brings us to the end of this video. The source code of what we've built is like always linked in the description as well. And next to that, if you think these videos are useful, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel, because that really means a lot to me. And also, don't forget to check out that Discord channel. I really would love to have you there. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.